The ancient bell of Cathedral of Saint Cassian struck midnight, its deep resonance echoing through empty halls. Zephyr Callahan, a man who had lost everything, knelt before the altar in complete darkness, his desperate prayer piercing the silence. What happened next would leave doctors, priests, and an entire city questioning everything they believed about faith, miracles, and the thin line between despair and divine intervention. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button now because you won't want to miss the incredible journey of a man whose darkest hour became the catalyst for a miracle that would change not just his life, but an entire community forever. 6 months earlier. The polished leather shoes hit the pavement with a dull thud. A briefcase tumbled from trembling fingers, spilling its contents across rain-slicked concrete. Zeph Callahan stared at his reflection in a skyscraper's dark glass, barely recognizing the man looking back at him. His tailored suit, once a symbol of success, now felt like a costume, a remnant of a life that had crumbled faster than anyone could have predicted. Final notice of termination. The words on the letter had read, "Immediate effect. Company restructuring. Global economic downturn." The phrases blurred together, a corporate eulogy for 15 years of dedication. But it wasn't just the job. It was the beginning of an avalanche that would sweep away everything he had built. The Duskwater district's evening crowd parted around him like water around a stone, business people hurrying home to their families, their security, their certainty. Zeph remained frozen, watching his reflection fade as darkness claimed the city. His phone buzzed, another call from the bank, another reminder of mounting debts, missed mortgage payments, and the rapidly approaching point of no return. He thought of his empty apartment, stripped of everything valuable weeks ago. The memories of auction notices and apologetic faces from the repo men still burned fresh in his mind. His savings, carefully built over decades, had vanished into a failed investment, a guaranteed return that turned out to be an elaborate scam targeting desperate professionals like himself. A street musician, Indigo Indy Hayes, played a haunting melody on her violin beneath the shelter of Obsidian Bridge. The same bridge where Zeph had once passed homeless people with a mixture of pity and detachment, never imagining he would soon understand their reality from the inside. "Spare some change?" a gravelly voice asked. Zeph turned to find a weathered man with kind eyes, Cypress Blackwood, though Zeph didn't know his name yet. Something in the man's gaze suggested he recognized the look of someone on the precipice of losing everything. "First night's always the hardest," Cypress added softly, as if reading Zeph's future. Zeph fumbled in his pocket, finding his last $5 bill. He handed it to Cypress, an act of kindness that felt like a farewell to his old life. The man studied the bill, then looked back at Zeph with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "Keep it," Cypress said, pressing the money back into Zeph's hand. "Something tells me you'll need it more than me soon enough. But remember this moment. Sometimes you have to lose everything to find what you never knew you were looking for." Rain began to fall, gentle at first, then with increasing intensity. The expensive suit that had once represented success now clung to Zeph like a shed skin he couldn't fully abandon. He watched as the last remnants of his professional life, documents, business cards, the carefully curated debris of a corporate existence, dissolved in growing puddles at his feet. Above the cityscape, the spire of the Cathedral of Saint Cassian pierced the storm clouds like a needle through dark fabric. Zeph had passed it countless times but had never gone inside. He wasn't religious, had never been. Faith was something other people needed, he'd always thought. Success, security, control. Those had been his articles of faith. As night fell over Ravencross City, Zeph found himself walking without direction, his designer shoes scuffing against rough pavement. The weight of reality pressed down on him. No job, no savings, no home, no hope. The carefully constructed facade of his life had shattered, leaving him exposed to a world he'd spent his entire career trying to rise above. He passed the warmly lit windows of homes in the Aurora Heights district, catching glimpses of families gathering for dinner, of lives continuing their comfortable rhythms. Each scene was a reminder of what he'd lost, what he'd failed to protect, what he'd taken for granted. A neon sign flickered to life in the growing darkness. Haven's Keep, shelter for the homeless. Zeph's feet carried him to its door, but pride, the last possession he couldn't let go of, kept him from entering. Not yet. Not while he still wore the remnants of his old life like armor against the truth of his situation. Instead, he found himself drawn to the shadowy bulk of Saint Cassian's, its ancient stones promising, if not sanctuary, then at least shelter from the rain. As he approached its towering doors, a figure emerged from the darkness, Sister Amaranth Vale, though he wouldn't learn her name until later. Her eyes met his with an unsettling knowing, as if she had been waiting for him. "The church is closed for the night," she said, her voice gentle but firm. Then, after a pause that seemed to stretch into eternity, she added, "But perhaps you're not here by accident. Sometimes, Mr. Callahan, the darkest night is just the beginning of a new dawn." Zeph started at the sound of his name. He hadn't given it, hadn't spoken a word, but before he could ask how she knew him, Sister Amaranth had disappeared back into the shadows, leaving the massive church door slightly ajar behind her. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the stained glass windows like a divine invitation. Thunder rolled across Ravencross City like the voice of fate itself, and Zephyr Callahan, former executive, soon to be homeless, broken but not yet beaten, took his first step toward a midnight that would change everything. The Cathedral of Saint Cassian's interior stretched before Zeph like a cavern of shadows, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into darkness above. The rain outside intensified, drumming against centuries-old stained glass windows that filtered the city's artificial light into ghostly patterns across the stone floor. Each step echoed with accusation. He didn't belong here, in this sacred space, wearing the drenched remains of his former life. The wooden pews, worn smooth by generations of faithful, offered silent witness as Zeph moved deeper into the sanctuary. His expensive shoes, now ruined by rain and street grime, squeaked against the marble floor, a sound that seemed almost sacrilegious in the cathedral's heavy silence. He caught his reflection in a gilded panel and barely recognized himself. Hair plastered to his forehead, designer suit clinging to his frame like a death shroud for his former identity. "The faithful usually kneel," a voice emerged from the shadows, causing Zeph to stumble backward. Father Lysander Reeves stepped into a shaft of colored light, his white hair gleaming like a halo. The priest's eyes, sharp and knowing, seemed to peer straight through Zeph's carefully maintained facade. Though some find it easier to fall before they kneel. Zeph straightened his sodden jacket, a reflexive gesture from countless business meetings. "I'm not. I just needed to get out of the rain," he managed, his voice echoing in the vast space. "I'll leave once it lets up." Father Lysander's smile held something between amusement and compassion. "The rain outside isn't what brought you here, Mr. Callahan, and we both know it's not what's keeping you here either." He gestured to a small chapel off the main sanctuary. "There's a fire lit in there, and Sister Amaranth usually leaves some tea. Your pride might survive better if it's not quite so damp." The mention of Sister Amaranth pulled Zeph up short. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "How do you both know my name? I never—" "The mysteries of faith are numerous," Father Lysander interrupted, already walking toward the chapel. "Though I suspect the more pressing mystery for you is where you'll sleep tonight." He paused, turning back to face Zeph. "Unless the penthouse at the Sterling is still an option." The mention of his former residence, sold weeks ago to cover mounting debts, hit Zeph like a physical blow. He followed the priest, drawn as much by questions as by the promise of warmth. The small chapel offered a stark contrast to the cathedral's grandeur. Simple wooden chairs, a modest altar, and a fireplace where flames danced against stone walls. A ceramic teapot sat on a small table, steam curling from its spout as if it had been prepared moments ago, though Zeph hadn't seen anyone enter. Father Lysander poured 2 cups, the amber liquid catching the firelight. "Chamomile," he said, offering one to Zeph. Sister Amaranth insists it soothes troubled souls. Zeph accepted the cup, his cold fingers grateful for its warmth. I should go. I need to figure out. He trailed off, realizing he had no end to that sentence. Figure out how to rebuild an empire from scratch? Father Lysander settled into a chair, his movements deliberate. Or perhaps how to maintain the illusion of success while sleeping under Obsidian Bridge? Cyprus mentioned you might be joining their community soon. You know Cyprus? Zeph's question came out sharper than intended. The tea's warmth spread through his chest, but did nothing to ease the growing sense that he'd stumbled into something beyond his understanding. Everyone knows Cyprus, though few know his story. Did you know he was once the CEO of Blackwood Industries? Father Lysander's words hung in the air like smoke. Before the crash of '08, he had everything, much like you did until recently. Now he helps others navigate the space between what was and what could be. Zeph's hands tightened around the teacup. I'm not. This is temporary. I have prospects, contacts. I just need time to what? To pretend this isn't happening? The priest's voice remained gentle, but his words cut through Zeph's defenses like a blade through silk. Your phone hasn't rung once since you entered the cathedral. Your contacts already know about the scandal at your firm. The whispers about your involvement, whether true or not, have made sure those prospects you mention are as substantial as morning mist. The truth of it hit Zeph with physical force. He set the teacup down before his trembling hands could betray him further. Why are you telling me this? Because, Mr. Callahan, sometimes we need to lose everything we think we are to discover who we're meant to be. Father Lysander stood, his shadow dancing with the firelight. The cathedral's doors will remain unlocked tonight. Sister Amaranth has prepared a cot in the back room, unless your pride prefers the embrace of Obsidian Bridge. The priest moved toward the door, then paused. Oh, and Mr. Callahan? That security camera you've been worried about since you entered? It hasn't worked in years. Whatever happens in this sacred space tonight remains between you and a higher authority than mine. Left alone in the chapel, Zeph felt the last threads of his former life unraveling. The fire's warmth seemed to reach deeper than his damp clothes, touching something frozen within him. Outside, the rain continued its relentless drumming, nature's percussion accompanying the collapse of everything he'd once believed about himself. His phone, high-end, yet worthless without service, showed no missed calls, no messages, no lifelines from his former world. The screen reflected his face, and for the first time, Zeph allowed himself to really look. The deep lines of worry, the gray threading through his dark hair, the haunted eyes of a man watching his world crumble. In the main sanctuary, the ancient clock began to toll the hour, its deep resonance filling the sacred space with waves of sound. Zeph counted the chimes mechanically. 10 o'clock. 2 hours since he'd stood outside Haven's Keep, pride preventing him from seeking shelter. 2 hours since Sister Amaranth had spoken his name in the darkness. The choice before him was stark. Accept the humble cot offered in charity, or cling to the last shreds of his pride and face the streets. In the firelight's dance, Zeph saw his reflection in a small mirror on the wall. Designer suit, expensive watch, carefully maintained appearance. The costume of success he'd worn for so long now seemed like a stranger's clothes. With trembling fingers, he removed the watch, a graduation gift from a lifetime ago, and placed it on the table beside the cooling tea. The first piece of his armor willingly shed, though far from the last he would need to surrender before the night was through. Outside the chapel's warmth, the cathedral waited in shadows, its vast space holding centuries of prayers, confessions, and transformations. Somewhere in that darkness, a cot represented surrender to a new reality. And beyond the cathedral's ancient walls, the city continued its rain-soaked rhythm, indifferent to the drama of one man's fall from grace. Zephyr Callahan, former executive and master of his own destiny, stood on the threshold between pride and survival, unaware that in just 2 hours his entire understanding of faith, reality, and himself would be irreversibly transformed. The decision to stay unleashed a flood of emotions Zeph had been desperately holding back. Like a dam finally breaking, years of carefully maintained control crumbled in the sacred silence of St. Cassian's. He found himself wandering the cathedral's shadowy corridors, each step taking him further from the man he'd been just hours ago. The back room Father Lysander had mentioned wasn't hard to find, a humble chamber tucked away behind the sacristy. True to the priest's word, a simple cot waited there, its clean sheets glowing faintly in the darkness like a beacon of mercy. But Zeph wasn't ready, not yet. The thought of lying down, of surrendering to sleep in a church's back room, felt like signing the final papers on his old life's bankruptcy. Instead, he found himself drawn back to the main sanctuary. The rain had softened to a gentle patter against stained glass, and moonlight now pierced through breaks in the clouds, casting kaleidoscope shadows across the stone floor. The effect was both beautiful and unsettling, like nature itself was trying to communicate something just beyond his understanding. "The night holds many conversations, if we're willing to listen," a voice said, causing Zeph to spin around. Sister Amaranth stood in a shaft of moonlight, her presence so sudden it seemed she had materialized from the darkness itself. Her silver hair caught the light, creating an almost ethereal effect. Though most prefer to fill the silence with their own voices. "How do you keep doing that?" Zeph demanded, his nerves frayed by the events of the day. "Appearing out of nowhere, knowing my name, knowing about my life?" Sister Amaranth's smile held secrets. "Perhaps the better question is why you're still running from the conversation you need to have." She gestured to the altar. "He's always listening, you know, even to those who've spent their lives pretending he doesn't exist." "I'm not running from anything," Zeph protested, but even to his own ears the words rang hollow. "And I'm not here for that. I just needed somewhere to think." Thinking." Sister Amaranth moved to light a candle, its flame casting dancing shadows on the ancient walls. "The favorite shield of men who are afraid to feel. Tell me, Mr. Callahan, in all your careful thinking, did you ever consider that this moment was written in your story long before today?" The question struck a chord Zeph wasn't prepared for. "My story," he laughed bitterly, "was supposed to be different. Success, security, significance. I had it all planned out. And now..." He gestured helplessly at his rain-damaged suit, his ruined shoes. "Now you stand in God's house wearing the ashes of your carefully constructed identity," Sister Amaranth completed his thought. "Strange, isn't it? How we cling to our illusions of control until they're stripped away." A distant siren wailed through the night, its cry echoing off the cathedral's stone walls like a lost soul's lament. Zeph found himself sinking into a pew, the wood creaking beneath him like the sound of his breaking resolve. "I don't know how to be this," he admitted, the words tasting like defeat. "Homeless, helpless, hopeless." Sister Amaranth's laugh was unexpected, a sound like silver bells in the darkness. "Homeless? Perhaps for now. Helpless? That remains to be seen. But hopeless?" She shook her head, lighting another candle. "Hope isn't found in bank accounts or business suits, Mr. Callahan. It's found in the moments when we finally stop pretending to be gods of our own lives." Something in her words sparked a memory, a childhood moment long buried. Himself as a boy, kneeling beside his grandmother's bed as she taught him the Lord's Prayer. He'd forgotten that time, had packed it away with other unnecessary parts of his past as he climbed the corporate ladder. "There was a time," he spoke slowly, the memory unfolding like a dusty photograph, "when I believed in something more. Before success became my religion. And now?" Sister Amaranth prompted, her voice gentle. "Now, I don't know what to believe." The admission cost him something, but it also lifted a weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "Everything I built my life on has crumbled, every certainty, every plan." Sister Amaranth's eyes gleamed in the candlelight. "Now we come to it. The real reason you're here tonight. Not because of the rain, not because of the cold, but because somewhere in that carefully constructed fortress of self-reliance, a foundation stone has shifted." The cathedral's ancient clock struck 11, its deep tones resonating through the empty space like a countdown to something inevitable. Each strike seemed to chip away at another piece of Zeph's armor, until he felt more exposed than he had in years. "In 1 hour," Sister Amaranth said, her voice taking on an almost prophetic quality. "Midnight will paint this sanctuary in shadows deeper than any you've known. And in that darkness, Mr. Callahan, you'll face a choice that will echo through the rest of your days." "What choice?" Zeph asked, but Sister Amaranth was already moving away, her figure seeming to fade into the darkness between candlelight. "The choice between holding onto the ashes of who you were," her voice floated back to him, "or surrendering to the fire of who you're meant to become." Left alone in the vast sanctuary, Zeph felt the weight of time pressing down on him. The candles Sister Amaranth had lit cast just enough light to make the shadows deeper, more significant. Each flicker seemed to reveal another crack in the facade he'd maintained for so long. He found himself moving toward the altar, drawn by a force he couldn't name. The moonlight through the rose window above cast a perfect circle of light at its base, like a spotlight waiting for an actor to take his mark. But this was no performance, no carefully rehearsed business presentation. This was the raw edge of reality, where all his practiced words and polished responses felt useless. As midnight approached, Zephyr Callahan stood at the crossroads of his soul, unaware that the next hour would shake not just his understanding of faith, but the very foundations of everything he believed about reality itself. The cathedral held its breath, waiting for the moment when desperation would give birth to miracle, and a man's darkest hour would become the doorway to his greatest transformation. The cathedral's massive clock continued its relentless march toward midnight, each tick echoing through the sacred space like footsteps approaching destiny. Zeph found himself drawn to a massive painting near the altar, a Renaissance depiction of Jacob wrestling with the angel. In the flickering candlelight, the figures seemed to move, locked in their eternal struggle between human will and divine purpose. "Beautiful, isn't it?" A new voice cut through the silence. Cypress Blackwood emerged from the shadows near the confessional, his weathered face serene in the dim light. Gone was the homeless man from the street. Something in his bearing spoke of forgotten nobility. The moment when a man finally fights God honestly, instead of running from him. Zeph startled at the sudden appearance. "How did you get in here?" "The same way you did," Cypress smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Through the door Sister Amaranth left open. Though perhaps the better question is, why are we both here on this particular night?" The former executive turned away from the painting, uncomfortable with how the angel's eyes seemed to follow him. "If you're here to remind me again about losing everything, Father Lysander already covered that territory." "Ah, you've met our good father." Cypress moved closer, his footsteps making no sound on the stone floor. "Did he tell you about the night I spent here? 5 years ago when my own empire crumbled?" This caught Zeph's attention. "He mentioned you were like me. Before. Like you?" Cypress's laugh held no mirth. "I was worse than you, Mr. Callahan. At least you only lost your money through others' deception. I destroyed lives with my greed, families ruined, pensions emptied, all in the name of profit." He gestured to his humble attire. "This isn't poverty, Mr. Callahan. This is penance." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Zeph found himself drawn to one of the cathedral's high windows, where city lights pierced the darkness like distant stars. "I didn't destroy anyone," he said, but uncertainty crept into his voice. "No?" Cypress moved to stand beside him. "What about Thomas in accounting? The one whose warnings about the investment scheme you ignored because the potential returns were too tempting? Or Sarah from legal, who tried to show you the discrepancies in the documents?" Each name hit Zeph like a physical blow. "How could you possibly know?" "Because pride leaves the same tracks in every life it destroys," Cypress cut him off. "We think we're so different, so special in our success. But in the end, we all bleed the same when we fall." The cathedral's atmosphere seemed to thicken, as if the very air was charged with the weight of confession. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, another soul in crisis in the city of endless nights. "What happened to you?" Zeph found himself asking. That night you spent here? Cypress turned away from the window, his face half hidden in shadow. I met truth. Not the comfortable lies we tell ourselves about success and self-sufficiency, but the burning truth that strips away every pretense. He paused, considering his next words carefully. I came here much like you, wealthy in things, bankrupt in soul. I left with nothing but everything that mattered. You're speaking in riddles, Zeph protested, though something in Cypress's words resonated deeper than he cared to admit. Am I? Cypress gestured to the vast empty sanctuary. Look around you, Mr. Callahan. Really look. What do you see? Zeph scanned the sacred space, the soaring arches, the ancient stones, the dancing shadows cast by Sister Amaranth's candles. I see a church. A beautiful one, but still just a building. And therein lies your first problem, Cypress sighed. You see what your eyes tell you exists, instead of what your soul knows is real. Tell me, in all your years of accumulating wealth, did money ever fill the emptiness that drove you to earn it? The question struck home with uncomfortable accuracy. Zeph remembered countless nights in his penthouse office, surrounded by the trappings of success, feeling a hollow ache that no achievement could fill. I thought if I just reached the next level, made the next deal. He trailed off, the futility of it all suddenly apparent. The next level, the next deal, the next, Cypress echoed. Always chasing tomorrow's promise to avoid today's truth. But midnight has a way of stripping away tomorrow's illusions, doesn't it? As if on cue, the clock began to strike 11:30. Each toll seemed to reverberate through Zeph's bones, counting down to something he could feel approaching but couldn't yet see. Half an hour, Cypress said softly. Half an hour until you face the same choice I faced. The same choice every soul faces when it finally runs out of places to hide. What choice? Zeph asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Between holding on to who you think you are. Cypress moved toward the altar, his figure seeming to grow more substantial with each step. Or surrendering to who you're meant to become. The words echoed Sister Amaranth's earlier statement so precisely that Zeph felt a chill run down his spine. Who are you? Really? Cypress turned back, and for a moment, his eyes seemed to hold the weight of centuries. Tonight, I'm just a messenger, a witness to what's coming. The real question, Mr. Callahan, is who are you? Not your job title, not your bank balance, not your carefully crafted image. Who are you in the darkness, when all those things are stripped away? The question hung in the air like incense, demanding an answer Zeph wasn't sure he had. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the silence that replaced it felt even heavier. Each minute that ticked by seemed to carry him closer to an encounter he both dreaded and desperately needed. When midnight comes, Cypress said, already moving back toward the shadows. Remember this, the darkness before dawn is always deepest, but it's in that darkness that light becomes most necessary and most transformative. Before Zeph could respond, Cypress had vanished into the cathedral's shadows, leaving behind only the echo of his words and the growing weight of approaching midnight. The candles Sister Amaranth had lit flickered in an unfelt breeze, their flames painting moving pictures on the ancient walls. Alone again in the vast sanctuary, Zephyr Callahan felt the last remnants of his carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. In 30 minutes, he would discover that sometimes the end of everything you thought you were is just the beginning of who you were always meant to be. 15 minutes until midnight. The cathedral's vast space seemed to contract around Zeph as he paced between the pews, his footsteps echoing off ancient stones that had witnessed countless dark nights of the soul. Sister Amaranth's candles had burned lower, their flames casting increasingly desperate shadows that danced like lost spirits across the walls. The conversation with Cypress had left him shaken, stripped of the last pretenses he'd been clinging to. Each step took him past another reminder of wealth's insignificance, gold-trimmed altarpieces that couldn't buy peace, jeweled crosses that couldn't purchase redemption, ornate offerings that couldn't fill the void he'd spent a lifetime trying to ignore. Time moves differently here, doesn't it? Father Lysander's voice drifted from the darkness near the confessional. The priest emerged slowly, as if allowing Zeph time to brace himself for another encounter. Especially in these last minutes before midnight. Zeph stopped pacing, suddenly aware of how his expensive shoes had been scuffing the sacred floor. Why does everyone keep talking about midnight? What's supposed to happen? Supposed to? Father Lysander smiled mysteriously. Nothing is supposed to happen, Mr. Callahan. Everything that occurs in this sacred space happens because it must. He moved to one of the candles, adjusting its position slightly. Tell me, what do you see when you look at these flames? Zeph studied the flickering lights, trying to understand the priest's purpose. Candles. Just ordinary candles. But Sister Amaranth lit these with a purpose. Look closer. How many are there? Zeph counted quickly. 12. 1 for each. Hour? Father Lysander finished. Perhaps. Or 1 for each month you spent ignoring the warnings about that investment scheme. 1 for each employee whose concerns you dismissed. 1 for each time you chose pride over truth. The words hit with devastating accuracy. Zeph sank into the nearest pew, the weight of recognition finally too heavy to bear. How can you know all this? The better question, Father Lysander said, sitting beside him, is how could you not know it? Every decision, every dismissal, every moment of choosing wealth over wisdom, they've been written on your soul all along. We just tend to read those inscriptions most clearly when we have nothing left to distract us from them. The cathedral's atmosphere grew heavier, as if the very air was becoming charged with approaching significance. 10 minutes until midnight. Each of Sister Amaranth's candles seemed to burn with increased intensity, their light almost painful to look at directly. What happened to Cyprus? Zeph asked suddenly. That night he spent here. What really changed? Father Lysander was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on the dancing flames. He died. What? Zeph turned sharply to look at the priest. The man who entered this cathedral that night. The proud, wealthy, self-sufficient man. He died. What emerged at midnight was someone else entirely. Father Lysander's voice took on a deeper resonance. The question is, Mr. Callahan, are you prepared for the same death? I don't understand, Zeph protested, though something deep within him trembled with recognition. Understanding isn't required. Father Lysander rose, moving toward the altar. Only surrender. The mind comprehends so little of what the soul already knows. 5 minutes until midnight. The cathedral's atmosphere had become almost unbearable, charged with an energy that made the hair on Zeph's neck stand on end. The candle's flames now stood perfectly still, despite the air's heaviness. When I was a younger priest, Father Lysander spoke softly, I thought my role was to guide people to answers. Now I know better. My role is simply to witness the moments when souls finally ask the right questions. And what's the right question? Zeph managed to ask, his throat tight with anticipation. That depends entirely on what you're ready to hear answered. The priest turned back to face him, his expression both compassionate and unyielding. But midnight has a way of asking its own questions, doesn't it? Questions we've spent our whole lives running from. 3 minutes. The cathedral's massive clock seemed to slow, each tick reverberating through Zeph's bones like a judgment. The stained glass windows had gone completely dark, no longer showing even a hint of the city beyond. Listen, Father Lysander commanded softly. In the growing tension, Zeph could hear it, beneath the clock's ticking, beneath his own rapid heartbeat, beneath the weight of approaching midnight. A sound like distant singing, or perhaps weeping. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a chorus of voices just beyond the edge of comprehension. What is that? He whispered, afraid to speak any louder. The prayers, Father Lysander replied. Every prayer ever uttered in this sacred space. They never really leave, you know. They just wait for the right moment to be heard again. 1 minute. The candle's flame suddenly stretched toward the ceiling, casting impossible shadows that seemed to take on forms of their own. The singing, weeping sound grew stronger, more distinct, yet still just beyond understanding. "Remember," Father Lysander's voice seemed to come from a great distance, though he stood only steps away. "What dies at midnight isn't you. It's only who you thought you were. The real question is, who will you become when that false self falls away?" 30 seconds. The air itself seemed to pulse with potential, with promise, with threat. Zeph found himself on his knees, though he couldn't remember falling. The floor beneath him felt both solid and insubstantial, as if reality itself was holding its breath. "Please," he whispered, though he wasn't sure who he was addressing or what he was asking for. 10 seconds. The candle's light began to swirl, creating patterns that defied physics and reason. The singing, weeping reached a crescendo that was felt more than heard. 5 seconds. Father Lysander's voice, now seemingly from everywhere at once. "Let go." 3 seconds. The floor beneath Zeph's knees became transparent, revealing depths that stretched into infinity. 2 seconds. Every shadow in the cathedral seemed to gather, to coalesce, to wait. 1 second. Zeph's last conscious thought was a prayer he hadn't known he remembered. "Lord, have mercy." Midnight struck, and Zephyr Callahan's world exploded into light and darkness simultaneously, as reality itself seemed to tear open at the seams. What stepped through that tear would change not just his life, but the very nature of what he believed possible. The first stroke of midnight tore through the cathedral like a blade through silk, splitting reality wide open. Zeph's world dissolved into pure light, not the gentle illumination of Sister Amaranth's candles, but a searing radiance that penetrated every shadow of his being. The 12 flames shot upward, becoming pillars of fire that reached toward the vaulted ceiling. "Open your eyes," a voice commanded. Not Father Lysander's gentle tone, not Sister Amaranth's knowing whisper, not even Cypress's weathered wisdom. This voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filling the sacred space with authority that brooked no denial. Zeph hadn't realized his eyes were closed. When he opened them, the cathedral had transformed. The walls had become transparent, revealing endless corridors of light that stretched beyond human comprehension. The altar glowed with an inner fire, and the air itself seemed alive with dancing particles of golden light. "Stand," the voice commanded again. Zeph's legs obeyed before his mind could process the instruction. As he rose, he noticed his expensive suit had begun to shine with an inner light, each thread becoming illuminated as if woven from starlight. Before him stood a figure that defied description, neither male nor female, neither young nor old, but radiating a presence that made Zeph's knees buckle. The being's form seemed to shift and change, one moment appearing as a warrior with wings of flame, the next as a gentle presence of pure light. "You have carried your burden long enough," the figure spoke, each word resonating through Zeph's very essence. "Show me what weighs upon your soul." Without conscious thought, Zeph reached into his suit pocket and withdrew something he hadn't known was there. A heavy chain of dark metal, each link inscribed with moments from his past. He saw his dismissal of Thomas's warnings, Sarah's concerned face as she tried to show him the documentation, the moment he signed off on the fraudulent investment, each decision that had led to his downfall. I didn't know I was carrying this," he managed to whisper. "We rarely do," the figure replied, its voice softening. "Humans wrap their chains link by link, day by day, choice by choice, until the weight becomes so familiar they forget it isn't natural." The chamber of light pulsed with each word, and Zeph watched in amazement as scenes from his life played out in the air around him. He saw himself as a young boy, praying with his grandmother, full of innocent faith. Then the gradual hardening of his heart as success and ambition took root, each promotion adding another barrier between his soul and truth. "You chose this night," the figure continued, moving closer. The air crackled with energy where it stepped. "Though you thought you came here to escape the rain, your soul knew better. It has been preparing for this midnight since the moment you first turned from love to chase the illusion of control. Zeph felt tears running down his face, but they weren't tears of water. They shone with the same golden light that filled the chamber. Each drop that fell seemed to carry away a piece of his former self, dissolving the careful construct of identity he'd built over decades. "What's happening to me?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Death," the figure replied simply. "And birth. The two are always intertwined at moments like these." The chain in Zeph's hands had begun to glow red hot, but strangely it caused no pain. Instead, each burning link revealed a name, a face, someone he had wronged or dismissed in his climb to success. As each name became visible, he felt the weight of recognition, of responsibility, of regret. "Speak their names," the figure instructed. "Acknowledge what was broken." "Thomas Chen," Zeph began, his voice growing stronger with each name. "Sarah Martinez, Michael Thompson." The list continued, each name carrying the weight of actions that couldn't be undone, choices that had led to consequences he'd never considered. As he spoke the final name, the chain shattered into thousands of fragments of light, each one floating upward to join the swirling cosmos that the cathedral's ceiling had become. The figure nodded in approval, but its expression suggested this was only the beginning. "You have named what was broken," it said. "Now you must choose what will be rebuilt." The air around them shifted, and Zeph found himself standing in what appeared to be a gallery of mirrors. But each reflection showed a different version of himself, the ambitious executive he had been, the broken man he was now, and countless other possibilities he could become. "Your wealth was not your sin," the figure explained, gesturing to the mirrors. "Your sin was believing it made you more than human, less in need of grace. Look carefully at each reflection. See the truth of who you've been, who you are, who you might become." In one mirror, Zeph saw himself working at Haven's Keep, serving meals to the homeless with a peace in his eyes he'd never known in his executive suite. In another, he was teaching financial literacy to former inmates, using his knowledge to uplift rather than to accumulate. Each reflection showed a different path, a different way of transforming his skills and experience into service rather than self-aggrandizement. "The choice is yours," the figure said, its light beginning to dim slightly. "But know this, what dies at midnight cannot be resurrected. The man you were must remain in the tomb of this moment if the man you're meant to be is to live." The cathedral's atmosphere began to shift again, the infinite corridors of light slowly contracting. The figure's presence became less overwhelming, though no less real. Zeph felt something breaking open inside him, not the shattering of before, but a gentler opening, like a flower turning toward the sun. "What should I do?" he asked, though even as the words left his mouth, he realized he already knew the answer. "Live," the figure replied simply. "Live with the wisdom bought at such great cost. Live with the understanding that every gift you were given was meant for more than your own glory. Live knowing that this midnight was not an ending but a beginning." The sound of the final bell toll began to fade, and with it, the extraordinary light that had filled the cathedral. The figure's form became increasingly indistinct, but its presence remained, imprinted on Zeph's soul like a seal of fire. "Remember," its voice echoed as reality began to resettle around them. "Midnight's darkness is always deepest just before the dawn, but those who die to themselves in the darkness find they can live more fully in the light." As the last echoes of the midnight hour faded away, Zephyr Callahan remained kneeling on the cathedral floor, transformed in ways that would take days, weeks, even years to fully understand. The man who had entered St. Cassian's running from his failures had indeed died at midnight. What remained was something altogether new, and the night was not yet over. As the final echoes of midnight faded from St. Cassian's halls, Zeph remained kneeling on the cathedral floor, his body trembling from what he'd experienced. The extraordinary light had dimmed, but something within him continued to glow, a warm certainty that settled in his chest like an ember from a divine fire. Sister Amaranth's candles had burned down to mere stubs, yet they still flickered with unusual brightness. The air around him felt different, charged with a lingering energy that made every breath feel like his first. His expensive suit, now wrinkled and stained from his ordeal, seemed to hang differently on his frame, as if his body itself had been subtly reshaped by the midnight encounter. The first moments after midnight are always the most delicate. Sister Amaranth's voice drifted from the shadows. She emerged carrying a simple clay cup filled with what appeared to be water. When the new soul is still adjusting to its reconstructed vessel, Zeph accepted the cup with shaking hands, noticing that the water seemed to shimmer with an inner light of its own. Was it real? He managed to ask, his voice hoarse as if he'd been screaming, though he couldn't remember making a sound. As real as the breath in your lungs, Sister Amaranth replied, settling beside him on the floor, her robes pooling around her like liquid shadow. Though you'll spend years understanding exactly what happened here tonight. The water, when he sipped it, tasted like nothing he'd ever experienced, like drinking liquid starlight, if such a thing were possible. Each swallow seemed to strengthen the glow within him, solidifying the reality of his transformation. Your eyes have changed, Sister Amaranth observed, studying his face intently. They always do after an encounter like that. The light leaves its mark. Zeph touched his face, half expecting it to feel different under his fingers. I saw everything. Every mistake, every choice, every moment that led me here. But also what might be, she completed his thought. The paths that open up when we finally stop running from our true purpose. The cathedral's interior had begun to take on a different quality, as if the stones themselves were breathing in the aftermath of what they'd witnessed. The stained glass windows, still dark with night, seemed to hold promises of dawn within their leaded frames. Cyprus, Zeph suddenly remembered. He said he died here, that night when he... Everyone who experiences midnight in Saint Cassian's dies in some way, Sister Amaranth nodded. The only difference is what rises in place of what was lost. She reached out and touched his hand, her fingers cool against his skin. The question is, Mr. Callahan, what has risen in you? Before he could answer, a sound filled the cathedral, soft at first, then growing stronger. It took Zeph a moment to recognize it as singing, though unlike any he'd heard before. The melody seemed to come from the very stones of the building, a chorus of voices joining in perfect harmony. The morning choir, Sister Amaranth explained, though Zeph could see no singers. They gather every night at this hour, though few have ears to hear them anymore. The music washed over him in waves, each note seeming to strengthen the new awareness that had awakened within him. He could feel the truth of his transformation settling into his bones, replacing the hollow ache of ambition with something fuller, deeper, more real. There will be practical matters to attend to, Sister Amaranth continued, her voice weaving through the ethereal music. The world outside these walls hasn't changed, even if you have. You'll still face the consequences of your past choices. But now I have something else, Zeph finished, understanding flowing through him like a river of light. Something that can't be taken away. Precisely. She smiled, the expression making her face suddenly appear ageless. Though remember, with great revelation comes great responsibility. What you've been given tonight isn't just for you. As if in response to her words, images began to flow through Zeph's mind, clear visions of what he needed to do next. He saw himself returning to the financial world, not as a player seeking profit, but as a guide helping others avoid the pitfalls he'd discovered. He saw himself working with the homeless, using his experience on both sides of fortune's divide to bridge worlds that rarely met. I need to make amends, he said slowly, each word carrying the weight of certainty. Not just apologies, but real changes, real help for those I've harmed. Now you begin to understand the purpose of tonight's death and rebirth? Sister Amaranth nodded approvingly. The light shows us our shadows so we can transform them into beacons for others. The invisible choir's song reached a crescendo, filling the cathedral with harmonies that seemed to vibrate at the frequency of creation itself. Zeph felt each note resonating with the new awareness inside him, strengthening his resolve. But first, Sister Amaranth rose gracefully to her feet. You need rest. Real rest, not the fitful sleep of the troubled soul you were when you entered here. She gestured toward the back room where the cot waited. Sleep now, Mr. Callahan. When you wake, the first light of dawn will guide your next steps. As Zeph stood, he noticed that his legs felt stronger than before, as if the very act of standing had been transformed by his midnight encounter. The cathedral's shadows no longer seemed threatening. Instead, they felt like old friends, keeping secrets he was only beginning to understand. Sister Amaranth, he called as she began to move away. Thank you for... She turned back, her smile knowing. I merely opened the door, Mr. Callahan. You chose to walk through it. Now rest. Tomorrow brings its own miracles. As Zeph made his way to the humble cot, he felt the weight of the night's events settling around him like a comfortable blanket. The invisible choir's song followed him, softening to a gentle lullaby that seemed to cradle his transformed soul. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Zephyr Callahan slept without the burden of ambition, without the weight of pretense, without the fear of falling. In his dreams, the light he'd encountered continued to work its subtle magic, preparing him for the dawn that waited just hours away. A dawn that would reveal just how complete his transformation had been. The first rays of morning light crept through Saint Cassian's stained glass windows, painting the cathedral floor in fragments of color. Zeph awoke on the humble cot, his body feeling simultaneously lighter and more substantial than it had in years. The memories of midnight's extraordinary events flowed through his mind with crystal clarity. Unlike dreams that fade upon waking, these images seemed to grow sharper in the dawn's early light. His ruined designer suit lay folded neatly on a nearby chair, replaced by simple but clean clothes that someone, Sister Amaranth he presumed, had left while he slept. Dark jeans, a gray sweater, and sturdy boots stood in stark contrast to his former executive attire, yet somehow felt more authentic than any custom-tailored suit ever had. The morning always brings clarity, Father Lysander's voice carried from the doorway. The priest stood holding 2 steaming cups of coffee, their aroma filling the small room with an unexpectedly homey scent, though few experience clarity quite like what you've been given. Zeph accepted one of the cups, noticing how even this simple act felt different, as if he were more aware of each muscle movement, each sensation. The coffee tasted richer, more complex than any expensive blend he'd ever ordered from high-end cafes. Everything feels more, he tried to explain, struggling to find words for his transformed awareness. More real? Father Lysander suggested, settling into a worn wooden chair. That's what happens when the veils are lifted. The world doesn't change, Mr. Callahan, but our capacity to experience it does. Through the small window, Zeph could see the city awakening. Streetlights flickering off, early morning workers hurrying to their jobs, the first buses beginning their routes. It all looked exactly the same as yesterday, yet completely different. There was a homeless man, he said suddenly, remembering the figure he'd passed daily on his way to work. Under the bridge near my old office, I used to walk past him every morning, pretending not to see. Ah, Marcus, Father Lysander nodded. Former neurosurgeon. Lost everything to addiction after his wife died. He's been clean for 2 years now, though few who pass him know that. The casual revelation of the man's story hit Zeph like a physical blow. How many others had he passed by, their stories untold, their humanity unacknowledged? I need to start there, he said with sudden certainty. Not with grand gestures or big plans, but with seeing. Really seeing. Now you begin to understand what the light revealed. Father Lysander smiled. Transformation isn't just about changing ourselves. It's about changing how we perceive everything and everyone around us. A soft knock at the door announced Sister Amaranth's arrival. She carried a simple breakfast of bread and fruit on a wooden tray. But like everything else this morning, the humble food seemed to radiate with new significance. You'll need sustenance, she said, setting down the tray. The first day after midnight is always the most challenging. when the transformed soul begins to interact with an untransformed world. As if to emphasize her point, distant sirens wailed through the morning air, the city's pain calling out at the edge of awareness. Zeph felt each cry more deeply than he ever had before, understanding now that every siren represented a story, a soul, a moment of crisis or need. "What do I do now?" he asked, though the question was directed more at the universe than at his companions. "How do I live with this? Awareness." "You begin," Sister Amaranth replied simply. "One moment, one choice, one act of seeing at a time. The light showed you possibilities, but you must walk the path yourself." Father Lysander moved to the window, gazing out at the awakening city. "Your old life prepared you for this, you know. All those skills you developed pursuing wealth, organization, strategy, persuasion, they were never meant for accumulation. They were preparation for distribution." The truth of it resonated through Zeph's transformed awareness. Every talent he'd used to climb the corporate ladder could be redirected, used to build bridges instead of walls, to lift others instead of elevating himself. "Cyprus," he remembered suddenly. "Will I see him again?" Sister Amaranth and Father Lysander exchanged a meaningful glance. "Cyprus appears when needed," Sister Amaranth said carefully, "though rarely in the same form twice. His work, like yours now, takes many shapes." The morning light had strengthened, filling the small room with increasing clarity. Zeph could hear the cathedral coming alive, distant footsteps, whispered prayers, the subtle sounds of ancient stones warming in the sun. "There are papers in the drawer beside you," Father Lysander mentioned, his tone deliberately casual. "Documents for Haven's Keep. They're looking for someone with financial expertise to help restructure their outreach programs. The position doesn't pay much, but it pays in ways money can't measure." Zeph completed the thought, understanding flowing through him. He opened the drawer, finding a simple folder containing the application forms. The position title made him smile. Financial Recovery Counselor. "Your midnight revelation came with responsibility," Sister Amaranth reminded him. "This is one way to begin fulfilling it." As Zeph looked through the papers, his transformed awareness showed him possibilities he would have missed before. Ways to use his business knowledge to expand the shelter's services, strategies for connecting with corporate donors, methods for teaching financial literacy to those rebuilding their lives. "This isn't an ending, is it?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Last night, the transformation. It's just the beginning." "Every ending is a beginning," Father Lysander confirmed. "Every death contains a resurrection. The question is whether we have the courage to fully live the new life we're given." Outside, the morning sun had cleared the city's tallest buildings, sending shafts of light through Saint Cassian's stained glass windows. The cathedral's interior blazed with color, as if the midnight revelation was being reaffirmed by dawn's illumination. Zeph stood, feeling the weight of his new purpose settling around him like a comfortable garment. The simple clothes felt right now, appropriate for the work ahead. His old suit, still folded on the chair, looked like a costume from a play he'd finished performing. "Remember," Sister Amaranth said as he gathered the application papers, "what happened at midnight was a gift, but what you do with it is a choice. Each moment from now on is an opportunity to prove that the transformation was real." The morning light streamed through the window, illuminating the path ahead with perfect clarity. Zephyr Callahan, transformed by midnight's mystery, stepped forward into his new purpose, not with the confident stride of his executive days, but with the humble certainty of one who had died to himself and been reborn into something greater. The morning sun had fully risen over Ravencross City as Zeph stepped out of St. Cassian's massive doors. The world outside seemed simultaneously familiar and startlingly new, as if he were seeing everything through freshly cleaned glass. The usual morning crowd hurried past, office workers clutching coffee cups, students rushing to early classes, delivery trucks making their rounds. But now he saw beyond their surface movements to the stories written in their faces. "The first step is often the hardest," Cypress's voice came from beside him, though Zeph hadn't heard him approach. The former CEO was dressed simply as before, but something about him seemed different in the morning light, more substantial, more real. "Where do I start?" Zeph asked, clutching the Haven's Keep application forms in his hands. "You already have." Cypress gestured to a figure huddled in a doorway across the street. Marcus, the former neurosurgeon Father Lysander had mentioned. By seeing what was always there, waiting to be acknowledged. Zeph crossed the street, awareness of his transformed purpose growing stronger with each step. Marcus looked up as they approached, his intelligent eyes showing a spark of recognition. "The suit," Marcus said, his voice rough but educated. "Though not today, it seems." "Not anymore," Zeph replied, understanding flowing between them. He reached into his pocket, finding the protein bar Sister Amaranth had slipped there before he left. "Would you share breakfast with me?" The simple question seemed to hang in the morning air like a bridge between worlds. Marcus studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You've been to the cathedral," he said. It wasn't a question. "Last night," Zeph confirmed, settling onto the steps beside him. "At midnight." "Ah." Marcus's eyes softened with understanding. "Sister Amaranth's midnight ministry. I had my own encounter there, 2 years ago. The night I finally chose sobriety." Cypress had remained standing, watching their interaction with approval. "Every midnight transformation ripples outward," he said, "touching lives in ways we can't predict." As they shared the simple breakfast, Marcus spoke of his journey, the brilliant career, the devastating loss, the descent into addiction that had cost him everything. But he also spoke of redemption, of the night he'd sought shelter in Saint Cassian's and found something far more valuable than physical safety. "I could practice medicine again," he admitted quietly. "My license was suspended, not revoked. But something holds me here, helping others who are where I was." "The light shows each soul its true purpose," Cypress nodded, "even when that purpose seems incomprehensible to the world's wisdom." A young woman approached them hesitantly, Dr. Vesper Crane from the night shelter program, though Zeph didn't know her yet. She carried a medical bag and wore an expression of practiced compassion. "Morning rounds, Marcus?" she asked, kneeling to check his vitals with practiced efficiency. "Blood pressure's better today." "My friend here brings good breakfast," Marcus smiled, indicating Zeph. Something in his tone suggested the word friend was carefully chosen. Dr. Crane turned to study Zeph with professional interest. "You're new to the street," she observed. "But there's something different about you. You've seen it, haven't you? The midnight light?" Before Zeph could respond, more figures emerged from the morning crowd, familiar faces he'd passed countless times without truly seeing. Indigo Hayes, the street musician, carrying her violin case like a shield. Atlas Sterling, the compassionate security guard who'd often let homeless individuals shelter in his building's doorway during bad weather. Each face held a story, each life interconnected in ways he was only beginning to understand. "Haven's Keep is looking for help," Dr. Crane mentioned, noting the papers in Zeph's hands. "Someone who understands both worlds, the corporate maze and the street's reality." "That's where I'm headed next," Zeph confirmed, feeling the rightness of it settling in his chest. "Though I'm beginning to think this moment, right here, is just as important." Cypress smiled approvingly. "Now you're understanding. Every moment is a chance to live what the light revealed. Every interaction is sacred when seen through transformed eyes." The morning continued to unfold around them, but now Zeph saw the pattern in what had once seemed like chaos. Dr. Crane's medical rounds weren't just about physical health, they were opportunities for human connection. Indigo's music wasn't merely busking, it was healing for troubled souls. Atlas's small kindnesses rippled outward in ways that transformed lives one moment at a time. "Your skills aren't canceled," Marcus said suddenly, his doctor's insight still sharp. "They're redirected. The same precision that made you successful in business can help others navigate their way back from the edge." As if to emphasize his point, a young man approached their small gathering, one of Marcus's regular visitors, seeking advice about shelter services. Zeph found himself naturally joining the conversation, his business knowledge helping to clarify the complex application process. "See?" Cypress observed quietly. "The light doesn't destroy our abilities, it illuminates their true purpose." The morning sun had risen higher, warming the city streets and casting shorter shadows. The Haven's Keep application forms in Zeph's hands seemed to carry more weight now, representing not just a job, but a calling. "It's time," Cypress said, already beginning to move away. "Remember, the midnight light shows the path, but we must choose to walk it each morning." As their small gathering dispersed, Dr. Crane to her rounds, Indigo to her corner, Marcus to his ministry of presence, Zeph felt the full weight of his transformation settling into reality. The corporate world he'd known seemed like a distant dream, replaced by something more substantial, more real. The path to Haven's Keep lay before him, but he knew now that every step of the journey mattered. Each person he passed, each interaction, each moment of seeing and acknowledging the sacred in the ordinary, all of it was part of living out the midnight revelation. Walking toward his new purpose, Zeph carried with him the light that had transformed his darkness into dawn. The city around him remained unchanged, yet everything was different, because he was different, transformed by a midnight prayer into someone who could finally see the divine purpose woven through every moment of existence. Haven's Keep stood before him, a converted warehouse whose weathered brick exterior belied the vital work happening within. Zeph paused at the entrance, the application forms solid in his hands, feeling the weight of the moment. Through the large windows, he could see people moving about, staff and clients alike, each carrying their own story of struggle and hope. "First times are always the hardest," a familiar voice said. Sister Amaranth stood beside him, though he hadn't heard her approach. In the morning light, her presence seemed both more ordinary and more extraordinary than it had in the cathedral's midnight shadows. "What if I'm not ready?" Zeph asked, voicing the doubt that had been growing with each step from St. Cassian's. "Nobody is ever ready," she replied, her eyes twinkling. "That's why grace exists. Besides, you're not alone in this work." As if on cue, the door opened and Phoenix Nix Wolf emerged. The recovered addict turned counselor. His face bore the marks of hard-won wisdom, and his eyes held the same transformed awareness that Zeph had seen in Cypress. "Sister Amaranth said you'd be coming," Nix said, extending his hand. "Another midnight survivor, I hear." The term struck Zeph as perfectly appropriate. He had survived something, the death of his old self, the birth of something new. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to those who've experienced it themselves," Nix smiled, gesturing for him to enter. "Come on in. Sage is waiting to meet you." The interior of Haven's Keep was a study in organized compassion. What had once been an industrial space had been transformed into a multi-purpose facility: dining area, sleeping quarters, counseling offices, and what appeared to be classrooms. But what struck Zeph most was the light. Somehow the building's designers had managed to capture and amplify natural sunlight, creating an atmosphere of hope. Sage Thorn Quinn's office reflected the same thoughtful design. The philanthropist sat behind a simple desk, her silver hair and elegant posture suggesting both authority and approachability. Like Sister Amaranth, she seemed to exist simultaneously in the practical and mystical realms. "Zephyr Callahan," she said, rising to greet him. "Sister Amaranth told me about your midnight encounter, but more importantly, she told me about your background in finance." "My background," Zeph began, suddenly uncertain how to describe his former life. "It's complicated." "Everything meaningful is," Sage replied, gesturing for him to sit. "But complicated is exactly what we need right now. Haven's Keep is at a crossroads. We have the heart, the mission, the dedication, but without proper financial structure, we can't expand our services to meet growing needs." She spread several documents across her desk: budget reports, grant applications, corporate partnership proposals. To Zeph's transformed awareness, they looked like pieces of a puzzle waiting to be assembled into something greater. "Your experience in both worlds," Sage continued, "the corporate realm and now, the other side of prosperity. It gives you a unique perspective. We need someone who can speak both languages, who can build bridges between those who have resources and those who need them." The light shows each soul its purpose, Sister Amaranth added softly. Sometimes that purpose requires us to use old skills in new ways. As they discussed the position, Zeph felt his transformed awareness expanding. He could see possibilities in the financial documents that his old self would have missed, ways to structure programs that served both practical and spiritual needs, methods to engage corporate donors in meaningful rather than merely tactical ways. There's something else, Sage said, pulling out one final document. We've been developing a program to help executives who've fallen on hard times, people who, like yourself, have lost everything, but still have valuable skills to offer. We need someone who understands that journey. The symmetry of it struck Zeph with almost physical force. His own path from prosperity through crisis to transformation could become a roadmap for others facing similar challenges. It won't be easy, Nix warned, having remained quietly observant until now. Some days, the weight of others' pain feels overwhelming. That's why we all need to remember our own midnight moments. They give us strength when the work gets hard. As if to emphasize his point, a commotion arose from the main area. A man in a torn business suit had entered, his face bearing the same desperate expression Zeph had worn just yesterday. The man's hands shook as he clutched a briefcase that probably contained the last remnants of his former life. Without thinking, Zeph rose and moved toward him. "I know," he said simply, meeting the man's frightened eyes. "I know exactly where you are right now, and I can tell you there's hope, even if you can't see it yet." The man's defenses crumbled, and Zeph found himself guiding him to a quiet corner, sharing coffee and his own story of midnight transformation. As he spoke, he could feel Sister Amaranth's approving presence, though when he looked back, she had vanished as mysteriously as she'd appeared. "You see?" Sage said when he returned to her office. "This is why we need you. Not just for your financial expertise, but for your experience of grace." The morning light streamed through the windows, catching the dust motes in its beam and making them dance like the particles of divine light he'd seen in the cathedral. In that illumination, Zeph saw his path forward with perfect clarity. "When do I start?" he asked, though all of them knew he already had. 6 months after his midnight transformation at St. Cassian's, Zeph stood at the cathedral's altar again. This time, however, he wasn't alone. A group of 20 people gathered in the pews, former executives, displaced professionals, and others who had lost everything only to find something greater in their darkness. "Each of us has a midnight story," he began, his voice carrying easily in the sacred space. "Each of us has faced that moment when everything we thought we were crumbled away, leaving us naked before truth." The evening light filtered through the stained glass windows, creating patterns that reminded him of that transformative night. Sister Amaranth stood at the back of the cathedral, her presence a quiet affirmation. Father Lysander sat near the group, his expression showing pleased recognition of how far things had come. "But midnight isn't the end of the story," Zeph continued. "It's just the beginning. What matters is what we do with the light we're given." The financial recovery program at Haven's Keep had grown beyond anything they'd initially imagined. What had started as simple counseling sessions had evolved into a comprehensive system of support, transformation, and redemption. Former executives who had lost everything were now helping others navigate their own crises, creating a cascade of healing that touched countless lives. Dr. Vesper Crane, now a regular partner in their work, stepped forward to share her perspective. "The medical issues we see on the streets often stem from spiritual and emotional wounds," she explained. "What Zeph and this program have created is a holistic approach to healing, body, mind, and soul." Marcus, the former neurosurgeon, had become one of their most effective counselors. His story of falling from professional heights and finding new purpose resonated deeply with those facing similar journeys. He sat now among the group, his presence a testament to the possibility of transformation. "The light shows each soul its purpose," Zeph echoed Sister Amaranth's words from that first morning. "Sometimes that purpose looks nothing like what we originally planned for ourselves." As if to emphasize his point, the cathedral's massive doors opened, admitting Sage Thorn Quinn, accompanied by several corporate executives, potential donors who had come to witness the program's impact firsthand. "What you're about to see," Sage addressed them, "isn't just another charitable initiative. It's a transformation of how we view success, purpose, and the relationship between prosperity and spiritual wealth." The executives settled into the back pews, their expensive suits and careful expressions reminding Zeph of his former self. But he could see something else in their eyes too, a hunger for meaning that transcended financial success. One by one, members of the group stood to share their stories. A former hedge fund manager who now taught financial literacy to homeless youth. A retired corporate lawyer who helped negotiate better conditions for shelter residents. Each testimony built upon the others, creating a tapestry of transformation that filled the sacred space. 6 months ago, Zeph continued, I stood in this very spot, broken and alone. I thought I had lost everything. What I didn't understand was that losing everything was necessary to find what really mattered. Cypress appeared silently beside Sister Amaranth, his presence adding weight to the moment. The light through the windows had shifted, taking on the golden quality of approaching sunset. The midnight light shows us truth, Zeph said, but it's what we do with that truth that matters. Each of us here has been given a second chance. Not to rebuild what was lost, but to build something better. As he spoke, he could feel the resonance of his words with his own continuing transformation. The financial expertise he'd once used to accumulate wealth now served to create structures of support and renewal. The networking skills that had advanced his career now built bridges between worlds that rarely intersected. This cathedral, he gestured to the soaring space around them, isn't just a building. It's a threshold between what was and what could be. Each of us who has experienced midnight here carries a piece of its light into the world. The corporate executives in the back shifted in their seats, several of them taking notes. Sage had been right, showing them the program in this sacred space, letting them feel the weight of transformation, was more powerful than any traditional presentation could have been. What we're building at Haven's Keep, Zeph continued, isn't just a program. It's a testament to the truth that every ending contains the seeds of a new beginning. Every fall from grace can become a path to greater purpose. As if on cue, the cathedral's lights began to illuminate one by one, creating an effect remarkably similar to the midnight revelation he'd experienced. The executives in the back straightened, sensing something beyond the ordinary in the atmosphere. Look around this sacred space, Zeph invited them. See the light playing on ancient stones, the shadows holding centuries of prayers. This is where transformation begins, not in boardrooms or balance sheets, but in the moment when we finally surrender our illusions of control. Sister Amaranth moved silently through the group, lighting candles as she had on that fateful night. Each flame seemed to carry its own story, its own testament to the possibility of renewal. We invite you, Zeph addressed the executives directly now, not just to fund our work, but to become part of this transformation. To recognize that your success carries with it a sacred responsibility to those who have lost their way. The sun had nearly set, leaving the cathedral illuminated primarily by candlelight. In this gentle radiance, the boundaries between wealthy donors and program participants, between those who had and those who had lost, seemed to dissolve. Because in the end, Zeph concluded, we're all just souls seeking light in the darkness. And sometimes, like that midnight long ago, the light finds us when we least expect it but most need it. As his words echoed through the sacred space, Zeph could feel the ripples of his own transformation continuing to spread outward, touching lives in ways he could never have imagined during his corporate days. The midnight light that had changed his life was now changing others, creating a legacy of hope that would continue long after this evening ended. 1 year to the day after his midnight transformation, Zeph stood before Saint Cassian's massive doors in the growing darkness. The cathedral rose against the night sky like a monument to possibility, its spire piercing the low-hanging clouds that threatened rain, just as they had on that fateful night. Some nights are meant for remembering. Sister Amaranth's voice came from behind him. She stood with Father Lysander and Cyprus, their presence completing a circle that had begun exactly 1 year ago. "And some nights are meant for new beginnings," Father Lysander added, gesturing to the figures approaching through the darkness, souls seeking their own midnight revelation. The financial recovery program had evolved beyond anything they'd imagined. What had started as a simple support system had grown into a movement, touching hundreds of lives. But tonight was special. Tonight, another lost soul would face their midnight moment. Thomas Chen, the same Thomas who had tried to warn Zeph about the investment scheme, approached the cathedral steps. His own fall from grace had been recent, but his eyes already held the desperate seeking that Zeph remembered from his own dark night. "You were right," Thomas said simply, his voice rough with emotion. "About everything. And now I'm where you were." "No," Zeph replied gently. "You're where you need to be. Sometimes we have to lose our way to find our true path." The cathedral's interior welcomed them with familiar shadows and sacred silence. Sister Amaranth moved silently through the space, lighting the 12 candles just as she had done a year ago. Each flame seemed to hold a memory, a testament to the power of transformation. "I never thanked you," Zeph said to Thomas as they moved toward the altar. "Your warnings. If I had listened, things might have been different, but then I might never have found this path." "God writes straight with crooked lines," Cyprus observed, his weathered face peaceful in the growing candlelight. "Every fall from grace is an invitation to rise to something greater." The cathedral's massive clock began to count down toward midnight. Thomas took his place before the altar, just as Zeph had done 1 year ago. But this time, Zeph stood as witness rather than seeker, understanding finally the full circle of divine purpose. "The light reveals what we need to see," Sister Amaranth explained to Thomas. "Not always what we want to see. Are you prepared for truth?" Through the stained glass windows, the city's lights created patterns that seemed to move with purpose. The same windows that had witnessed Zeph's transformation now waited to reflect another soul's journey from darkness to light. "The midnight hour approaches," Father Lysander intoned. "The threshold between what was and what could be grows thin." As the final minutes ticked away, Zeph reflected on all that had changed. Haven's Keep now operated multiple programs, touching lives at every level of society. The corporate partnerships they'd built provided not just funding, but opportunities for meaningful change. Each soul that found its way to Saint Cassian's became part of an expanding tapestry of transformation. The clock struck midnight, and just as it had 1 year ago, reality itself seemed to shift. The same divine light that had transformed Zeph now filled the sacred space, but this time, he watched as observer rather than participant. Thomas fell to his knees, overwhelmed by the presence that filled the cathedral. Zeph understood now why Cyprus had appeared to him that night, why Sister Amaranth and Father Lysander served as guardian. Zeph understood now why Cyprus had appeared to him that night, why Sister Amaranth and Father Lysander served as guardians of this sacred process. Each transformed soul became part of the light's ongoing work, creating an unbroken chain of witness and renewal. As Thomas experienced his own revelation, Zeph offered a prayer of gratitude. The midnight light that had changed his life continued to transform others, creating ripples of grace that touched countless lives. His own journey had become a testament to the truth that no soul is ever truly lost, only waiting for its moment of divine encounter. When the light finally faded and Thomas rose, his eyes held the same transformed awareness that Zeph had seen in his own reflection 1 year ago. The circle was complete, yet also beginning anew. "Welcome," Zeph said simply, "to the first morning of your real life." Outside the cathedral, dawn approached. Not just another sunrise, but a testament to the eternal truth that darkness always gives way to light. The city waited, full of souls seeking their own transformation, their own midnight revelation. And in Saint Cassian's ancient halls, the light continued its work, one soul at a time, turning endings into beginnings, despair into purpose, and midnight prayers into miracles of grace. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.